Hey, everybody, welcome to Puddle Road. If you haven't already heard, there was a school shooting this past Monday. It was at Abundant Life Christian Academy, which is a K through 12 private Christian school, small school, I think roughly 300 some students. Throughout that event, there were multiple people who were, many of them taken to the hospital. Three lost their lives, a teacher, a teenage student, and then who was a 15-year-old girl apparently turned on herself. And I say if you haven't heard because these things are becoming so common that we just sort of brush by them. You see the headline and oh, that's bad, and keep scrolling. I remember the first I ever heard about, the first school, because it was the first school anyone had heard about. It was Columbine when I was in high school myself. That's all you saw on TV for weeks. I mean, we knew every detail of what happened that day, in the days and weeks leading up to that day, the childhoods of the perpetrators. I mean, we knew everything because it was such a shock. And today, unfortunately, it doesn't carry the same weight. Um, so that's all we know. I did come across a video where I think probably the police chief is laying out a timeline of what happened, and I just want to play a couple minutes of that just so you can hear what happened, and then I want to talk to you about it a little bit more in depth from just a pastor's perspective. So here's what he had to say about the timeline that day.
At 10:57 a.m., a second grade student called 911 to report a that occurred at school. Don't let that soak in for a minute. A second grade student called 911 at 10:57 a.m. to report at school.
It's just a baby.
Officers were dispatched to the school at 10:57. A deputy with the Dane County Sheriff's Office was the first officer to arrive on the scene at 11 a.m. 24 seconds later, the first Madison police officer arrived on the scene at 11:01 and immediately entered the school.
That's 3 minutes
Officers
after the call.
bravely entered the building as soon as they arrived, not knowing what they were going to encounter. At 11:05, officers inside the school alerted people that the shooter was down and that a gun had been recovered. At 11:05, the Madison Police Department also began setting up for parents and guardians at what we briefly described earlier for you as a reunification center that occurred at 11:05. The Madison Fire Department was dispatched to the scene at the same time. They arrived at 11:05 and began linking up with officers who were also inside, and they were instrumental with providing aid to victims who were suffering from gun wounds, potentially saving lives. The first public notice about the shooting was posted on the Madison Police Department Incident Report website at 11:13 a.m. Officers began clearing the school building at 11:14, and bomb dogs started to clear the facility at 11:23 a.m.
Wow, so man, like a half an hour after the initial call, everything's done and the school is being evacuated, cleared. Man, just what a sad, sad situation. Um, so I'm not here to do the normal reaction thing, right? There's going to be plenty of people who are arguing about what needs to be done and, the thoughts and prayers versus the control and all that stuff. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to pastor you because I know there are people when they encounter things like this, when they see things like this, it brings fear and it brings anxiety. And I totally get that. Parents with school age kids, this can hit hard. School age kids who, hear a story like this and then they've got to walk into their uh, school the next day and hear the doors click behind them and wonder, who's in here? What do they have in their backpack? It can be a very anxious time when we actually stop to listen to these kinds of stories. And that's what I want to speak to today because I know anxiety. I struggled with debilitating anxiety throughout my childhood and into my teen years. I am an only child, and I was raised by at the time, undiagnosed schizophrenic mom. She had paranoid schizophrenia, still does, an angry father, and there was me in the house, dealing with all that chaos and craziness and fear, and that'll mess a kid up. And so I dealt with a ton of anxiety. I feared way too many things and missed out on way too many opportunities because of that fear. But when I got into my mid to late teens, I started going to a very charismatic church. And within that church, there was, it's the typical ex- extreme end of the charismatic movement teaching about faith, that if you just have enough faith, then nothing bad can happen to you. That Jesus, when he died on the cross, he died for our sins, but also for our perfect health and perfect protection and wealth in this life. And that was part of the teaching. And as long as you have faith, then nothing bad can happen. Faith was like this super shield that went around you, right? And for a kid coming out of debilitating anxiety, the idea of having a force field, was a pretty easy sell. It was pretty easy to hold on to. But after, a few years of actually facing life and growing in maturity in the scriptures, I realized that that is not uh, what the Bible teaches, and that's really not how faith works. And yet, even though that's not how faith works, the Bible still clearly calls us to walk in faith and to live a life um, free from fear, or to at least be moving in that direction of living a life that is absent of anxiety and fear. You see it a lot in the Old Testament, right? In the Psalms, and like with David, he's always talking about, 1,000 will fall at my side and 10,000 at my right hand, but it won't come near me. That almost sounds like the more hyper faith version of it, right? If I have faith, everybody around me will be dying and falling out and being injured and suffering, but not me. Um, and there's some truth to that, but we also have to realize that it's the Old Testament. It's the Old Testament covenant. And in the Old Testament, God had Israel living in an earthly kingdom, right? They had an earthly king. They had earthly blessings. If they would obey God, then they would be blessed in earthly ways. Their crops would grow, and they'd beat their enemies, and they'd be protected, and they'd have wealth and all that. But then in the New Testament, when Jesus comes, it seems different. We don't have this earthly kingdom anymore. Jesus talks about this kingdom that's not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom, it's a kingdom within you. And now all of a sudden, Jesus is talking to his followers, not about, hey, follow me and you'll never get injured and you'll never have hardship and you'll kick all your enemies' butts and nothing bad will happen. He is saying, hey, follow me. And by the way, you'll probably suffer and die. It was totally different. And yet, in the New Testament, Jesus and the scriptures still call us to live a fearless life. How is that possible? How could Jesus tell us, hey, follow me, but there's no guarantee that things are going to go well when you do? You might be persecuted, you might be killed, like all these things might happen, and yet live fearlessly. How does that even add up? How does that work? And the way it works is this, is the promise that we have that this life isn't the end of it. This life is the smallest part of our actual life. I want to read something to you out of 1 Corinthians 15. So this is the Apostle Paul, and he's talking about death, which was a very uh, imminent thing for a lot of Christians in Paul's lifetime, even for himself. His death wasn't all that far off. He was going to be killed for following Jesus. But here's what he says. Um, 1 Corinthians 55 or 15, let's start with verse uh 53, okay? For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. That's talking about the physical body being changed into the eternal body, right, after somebody dies. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? And where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Paul's point here is that the reason that we, as followers of Jesus, can walk in faith and without fear, even when we have no guarantee that we're going to be protected and that bad things aren't going to happen to us, that we don't get, some kind of special ticket free from suffering and tragedy and all the stuff that comes with living in this world, even though we don't get an exception for all that kind of stuff, we can still live fearless lives because the ultimate thing that everybody fears, death. You know, the one thing that nobody escapes, everybody's vulnerable to, and no one knows when it's going to come, that is not a loss for us. It's not a loss for followers of Jesus. It's a win. The fear of death is produced by sin, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing who God is, not knowing that you are safe and that your last breath here is your first breath in a much, much, much better place. That's what makes it scary. And Paul says, for us to live is Christ, but to die is our gain. Because when this ticker quits ticking, we're going to see Jesus face to face and all will be made well. And one day, Christ is going to return and make everything right. We walk in that hope. If you're just a religious person and you go through the motions and you don't really know Jesus, then, you read that, but it kind of feels like a fairy tale. But if you know Jesus, if you walk with him, if you have relationship with him and his word is being built in you and his spirit lives in you, this is reality. This is reality, that I am standing just on the other side of this thin little veil of time and separation from being in the very presence of God. And whenever that time comes that the ticker quits ticking, I'm going to be with him and everything will be okay. Now, please hear me, I don't mean to make light of what happened on Monday. We feel the pain and the grief and the injustice of life in this world. I'm not saying that tragedy should be discarded and that people don't go through horrendous things and have every right in the world to grieve and be angry and ask questions and wrestle with doubt. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that at the end of the day, followers of Jesus, the Bible says we're weird. We are peculiar people because we have a hope that the world doesn't have. Because we live in the reality of a kingdom that you can't see with your eyes. And that reality gives us hope. Peace that passes understanding, that doesn't make sense, even in the midst of a world where there is real danger and real hurt, and that nothing is guaranteed. in the face of all that, we still walk in faith, in joy, in hope, and in freedom from anxiety and fear. So, in the middle of a very difficult story that we've just heard about, I want to encourage you to pray for the families who are grieving and hurting. It's right at Christmas time. I mean, how it's just, it makes it that much worse if it can even be worse. So pray for them, but also let this be a reminder to you, if you're a follower of Jesus, that death doesn't have the final victory, that the sting of death is taken away for those who are in Jesus, because he has promised to take away our sin, to set us free, and to give us life. Our last breath here is our first breath with him. And so with that, be encouraged. I love you, and we will see you next time on Puddle Road.